All right, so let's pick up from where we left off last week. We were halfway through the section of the four children, our Babanim. Just to remind you, this is a midrash. And one of the points I've been making over the past couple of weeks is it's almost impossible to understand the Haggadah unless you understand midrash as a literary category, right, in Judaism. What is a midrash? It is a rabbinic commentary on verses of the Bible. So this particular midrash answers the question, why is it that 4 times in the Torah, in different ways, we are told to respond to the questions or to answer the questions of the, someone saying something, Daniel. 4 different ways are we told to answer the questions, and the answer of the midrash is each questioner is a different type, and you answer according to the question. What's brilliant about this passage is, as many have remarked, it's not necessarily true that each of the 4 children is a different person, right? It is possible that it's the same person, but within us, there is a rebellious side and a good side. That is, the human personality is complex, and it's not unreasonable to think that we're answering the questions for each part of us. And actually, each year when we come back to the Seder, we might be feeling more like one child than another. And actually, some will say that that is human maturity. We start off as the she'eino yodea lish'ol. We start off life unable to ask questions and grow, right? So for some, this is the 4 children are 4 parts of ourselves that are constant. For others, they represent the stages of life. Rabbi Lau has a beautiful and very interesting take on this. He says each one of the 4 children is a different generation. So this is the Rabbi Lau, the Israeli chief rabbi. So he says the great-grandfather was the Chacham. He had the knowledge and the deep wisdom to ask the complicated questions. But the child of the great-grandfather becomes rebellious and wants to throw away the customs and rituals of his father. Then the 3rd generation is the Tam, who just is unaware, right? What mazot, what is this? In an innocent way, doesn't know what the ritual is about. And then the 4th generation doesn't even know how to ask. In other words, the trend towards assimilation ends with ignorance. And that is what she'eino yodea lish'ol means. Do with that what you will. I think it's very interesting and controversial, right? But in many ways, an experience of many Jewish families in modernity, right? The descent of the generations. But let's treat this for now as, I think, in the most simple way, which is to understand these 4 as different characters. So we said, what is really interesting about the Chacham? That the wise child is not wise because he knows but wise because he asks, and asks detailed questions, does not accept necessarily what is before him as a given, wants to know how the mechanics of everything. That's a profound statement about what it means to be wise, that sometimes it's in the details, as they say, where you find the biggest pieces of wisdom. What's the most interesting thing about the wicked child? You would expect the wicked child to be, as I said last week, to be someone who violates the laws, right? That's what a wicked child is, a sinner. But that is not the way the wicked child is understood in the passage, right? The wicked child is the one who excludes herself from the community. That is remarkable. Okay, now let's work on the third child. I don't think this is where we left off last time. So the tam gets a bad rap. We all know the tam as simple. I'm going to guess that if I asked you what is the English translation of tam, you would say simple. That's not necessarily what tam means. I don't know if any of you can think of a time where the word tam is used in Judaism. I know tam because my bar mitzvah parsha was Parshat Noach. And Noach is described, Eile toldot Noach, Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav. He was righteous or good in his generation, pure, wholehearted. Actually, in modern Hebrew, tam is often means purity, wholeness, completeness. When you finish a book, you say tam v'nishlam. We've concluded. I suggest that probably the best translation of the word tam is basic. The basic child. Basic is basic pejorative? It's not meant to be. To say, when a teacher says, I've covered all the basics, what the teacher is saying is, we've covered everything. We've fulfilled everything we've had to fulfill. Now, with that understanding in mind, I suggest you don't use the word simple son. I'm not even sure if I like the basic son. But this requires some explanation. We learn from the question. What is his question? Ma zot. Do you see that? The question of the simple son. Sorry, I just said I wouldn't say simple. Ve'amarta elav. This is what you say to him. V'chosek yad hotzianu Hashem mitzrayim mibeit avadim. Ma zot. What is this? With an outstretched arm, God saved us from Egypt. I think the Haggadah is really telling us that this is the average. This is the average person. And you answer their question straightforward as they ask it. Don't get too complicated. Cover the basics. Does this child get an A or does this child get a C if you were the teacher? It's interesting. I've had that debate at my Seder before about the simple son. I hate saying the simple. I'll just say the tam. I've had that. Does this child get an A or get a C? A B. Why a B?
Because I think he's above a C.
Okay.
But it doesn't quite reach the level of an A. But the fact that he can even say, what is this?
Yes.
Means he has an element of thought and an element
Right.
of curiosity.
Right. There's curiosity and thought and awareness, and the answer is straightforward. And I guess it really does depend on what you think the goal of the Seder is. If the goal of the Seder is to answer the questions, well, you answered his question. And maybe, someone who wants to argue that this child gets an A says, done. I mean, it's a sort of black and white thing. If the question was asked and the answer was given, it's over. But someone who would argue a B or a C even says, there's a trick to this whole Seder. The idea of the Seder is to provoke deeper thought and deeper questioning. And if you, even though you don't have to, Judaism calls for a more intense, a heightened level of curiosity and exploration, right? So that's, I think, the debate that we've tended to have at our table. Is it enough sometimes in life just to do the minimum, or are we provoking a deeper level of insight and saying that that's really the ideal?
I like your use of the word basic.
Yeah.
Because I think in knowing, you can't go further in an education without knowing the basics. It's the same thing in math. It's
Yes.
the same thing in cooking. So here he is asking the basic question, and getting the answer to that can provoke further learning. So I like that word.
Okay, great. I'm not sure how I feel about it because I don't like calling a child basic,
No.
the basic child. But I do think it's not unreasonable to say when a basic question is asked, right? But it's hard to translate that this way because the child is called Tam. But when a basic question is asked, provide the basic answer. And there's a role for that at the Seder. And this child isn't negatively portrayed, perhaps, right? Just he's different than the wise child. The wise child is, there's an aspect to the wise child that's unsatisfied, that's a bit rebellious, right? There's a piece of not taking anything at face value for the wise child, which is why, by the way, you would expect that since we have a child who is Rasha, who is wicked, that we would also have a child who is, what's the opposite of wicked? Where's the good child? So some will say the Tam is the good child, not the Chacham. Yes.
A simple child.
Yeah.
He's probably a more content person because they can see things, they're looking for things.
The simple child is a more content person because ignorance is bliss, right? To just accept, oh, mazot, what is this? Oh, this is the Seder. Great, right? I'm happy. I'll do whatever. Tell me what I have to do, right? But the wise child is not necessarily good. It's really important to note that the wise child, even though he may be highest on the hierarchy, is not portrayed as a goody two-shoes. He is inquisitive, wants to know details, a bit rebellious, pushing back on maybe manipulating a little bit. Yeah, right. right? It's very interesting. What's that?
Could be arrogant because he's so smart.
Yeah,
But they
Yeah.
both at different stages of maturity. Like the
Absolutely,
child
this could be-
a 3-year-old.
Uh,
and the
yes,
wise
absolutely. Absolutely, right? It is a very well-known interpretation of this passage that this could be stages of life. And sometimes you start off with being good, and then you start to question. The questions don't make you bad. The questions make you wise, but they don't necessarily make you good. The Tam is a good child, but it's a really extraordinary statement that I think the Midrash is making, that good is not the highest ranking child. The good child is not the highest ranking one, because the good child doesn't really contribute. The good child plays a role, takes what is given to him and responds and does what he's told. But why is the wicked child ahead? Like, do you think that this is a ranking? We certainly start off with a child named Wise. But is the simple child, the Tam, higher up on the lower down, on the totem pole than the wicked, and lower down than the one who doesn't know how to ask? So I don't have an answer to that question. I just want you to note it, that it's not necessarily true that the wicked child is seen in a negative way, because he's still at the table. He's wicked because of the way he asks his question, but we respond to his question intelligently and blunt his question and answer him even in a smarter way. So there is something that the wise child and the wicked child have in common, isn't there?
It's also interesting that they even use the word wicked to represent that child.
Right.
Because it's a very strong word with such terrible connotations. So I think a different word might have put a whole different slant on this whole thing.
Right. But so your thought is that word wicked makes us already upset with this child. But if we focus on his question, look at the question of the wicked child again. Ma avodah hazot lachem. What is this worship to you? And what do? You respond to his question. What is this worship to you? Is he paying attention? You bet he is. Does he have a question to ask? Absolutely. And you say, "Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li b'tzeiti mimitzrayim li velo lo." Well, we're doing this because God freed our ancestors from Egypt. And I guess if you would have been there, you wouldn't have been freed too, because you have a rebellious streak in you. My point is, I think the wicked child is higher up on the ladder than the simple child. There is something of a spirit of rebelliousness in the wise and the wicked child that the rabbis like. Why? Because the very idea of asking questions presupposes dissatisfaction. A person only asks a question if something bothers her, right? if you're just walking through the world and everything's okay, well, you don't have any questions. But the wise and the wicked child both are bothered. Now they don't, one asks the question in a rude way. But I think the simple child is degraded on the list because it's just the basics. The question is not being provoked by a spirit of challenge, which we find with the wise and the wicked child. If you go back to, so what is it in the human spirit that we are trying to emphasize when we say the wise and the wicked child are higher up on the ladder?
They don't take things at face value.
Thank you. And what is freedom? This is the celebration of freedom. Where does freedom come from? It comes from the ability to speak my mind. Every advanced democracy in the world that values freedom begins, or at least in the top 3 values, has freedom of speech. You have to be able to ask. You have to be able to challenge. You have to be able to talk. That's where it all comes from. So I want to upgrade the wicked child. I think this is, in my opinion, this is a hierarchy. And the wise child begins, and the wicked child's right up there with him. Wish he would ask the question in a different way, but we need wicked children. We need them, or we won't be able to think differently. The simple child just isn't ready yet to challenge. He's ready to observe and wonder, but not ready to reject. And rejection is really important, right? There can be rejection can come from a negative place. I don't accept this, but it can also come from a probing place, which I think it comes from for the wise child. What's this really about? Give me more details. I'm not accepting what you tell me at face value. So that's my spiel about the basic questioner, the basic question. And then finally, the one who is unable to ask. If you take a look at what it says about the one who is unable to ask, you'll find something really interesting. She'eino yodea lish'ol. There is someone who cannot ask a question. This is the lowest on the totem pole. Why? Why do you think we are so concerned with the one who's unable to ask? Right.
Not just does he, but is he able to?
Is he able to? So why would he not be able to? There's different understandings here. Why is this child unable to ask? Is he stupid?
Not necessarily.
Well, not necessarily. What else could it be?
Doesn't know enough to ask.
Doesn't know enough to ask? Yeah, possible.
Takes
What
things at
else?
face value.
Takes thing at face value? Yeah.
Sees things differently.
Just too
Or
young.
maybe this is a child who's been taught compliance. Maybe it's a child who's been taught, don't ask questions. I mean, how many times have you heard that as a sort of catchy way that a parent talks to his or her child? Don't ask questions, just do what you're told.
Wow, because I said so.
Why? Because I said so. And that ingrains in a child obedience, but not thoughtfulness. Fear even. So on a night when we want to talk about freedom and liberation, we mention and emphasize, I think, that a Jewish child cannot the way to raise a Jewish child is not to teach obedience and compliance, or you will get a she'eino yodea lish'ol. And your responsibility then is at petach lo. Let's just look at these words for a second. At petach lo. What is at? I thought you was ata. So probably at is Aramaic. In Aramaic, you can use at for you and not ata. But I want you to think of one other possible explanation. This is from Rabbi Margoliot. It's a very famous commentary on the Haggadah from the 50s. He says at is the female. At is in Hebrew, there's you female and you male. Ata and at. You the mother. That's number one. And what is the responsibility of the mother? Petach lo. What is liftoach? Open. Open for him. Right? So what are we saying here? Possibly. You, the motherly side, has to open for him. The challenge of, sometimes the motherly role as opposed to the fatherly role, classically in a gendered society, the mother's role is more nurturer, whereas the father's role is seen as boundary maker, right? It's a harsher love.
Your father gets home.
Right, exactly. A harsher love. If I'm going to make the claim that maybe the she'eino yodia lishol isn't stupid, he's just been taught too much fatherly love. Keep your mouth shut. Too much questioning. Just follow orders. Maybe at petach lo, this is what Rabbi Margoliot says, is a female motherly voice saying, you have a role to play to counter too much boundary-making fatherly love. You open for that child, that sense of inquisitiveness, right? I just think it's a fascinating, I don't know if it's true, but I think it's a fascinating read of this, that at is a female voice. And I like the word petach lo. It's your job to open up for him, not to smack an answer out of the child or smack a question or fix the child. Petach lo means there's a part of that child that's been closed. And you need, as a mother, or that motherly energy, to open that up. Tell the child that he can be okay speaking his mind, that it's all right to question things. You're still loved. That's a sort of motherly, unconditional love, nurturing love that might be called for the child who's unable to ask. Yes, there was a hand. No, there was no hand.
Well, I
Yes.
guess I'm thinking the low is if you're opening him up or you're opening it up for him. If there's a difference.
Unclear. At, we usually read, when we read the Haggadah, at petach lo, I think most Haggadot will say, prompt him.
Mhm. I think it says
What does it say?
you must initiate the subject for.
You initiate the subject for him. It's possible. I don't know what that means, initiate your child doesn't know how to ask a question. What seems to be taking place in the conversation, if you read this passage, is V'higadat ala bincha bayom hahu le'emor bavur ze asa Adonai li b'tzeitim mimitzrayim. It's the same answer we gave to the wicked son, actually. We just say, hey, this is Passover. This is Passover. And the child doesn't really have the opportunity to ask a question at all. So are you really engaging him? Not really. You're answering a question that he didn't ask. So I'm not a big fan of that read, the read of just skip over him, right? Don't even engage with him. Just give him the answer to the question he never asked, right? It almost seems like you're not paying attention to the child as well. I think that at petachlo gives us something to do for that child that actually speaks directly to what could be going on in his mind.
That a recent interpretation?
Yes, 50s, yeah, from the 50s.
I'm curious because.
Is that recent? I don't know. In the scheme of the Haggadah, 2,000 years old, it's pretty recent, right? But today, to say the word motherly love I'll offend half the room.
Yeah, I remember my booby telling me not to ask questions.
Yeah, right.
It's written, accept it, just
Yeah.
accept it. And that's small town Poland's philosophy, perhaps?
Yeah, it's written, just do it, don't ask questions,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not a gendered idea, but I think within the Haggadah, one can understand language as indicating a particular response. So I'm suggesting that at petachlo is evoking a different kind of motherly attention to that child, to respond to the very thing you were told as a child. So if someone is telling you, don't ask, just accept it as face value. Right? Too many times we think of the she'eino yodeh lishol as stupid. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think the she'eino yodeh lishol is ignorant. I think it's worse. I think the she'eino yodeh lishol knows how to ask, but isn't asking. That's why sometimes he's translated as not the one who cannot ask, but the one who is unable to ask. There's a big difference between one who cannot ask and one who is unable. One who cannot means there is no question in this child's head. But one who is unable to ask means there is a question, he just doesn't know how to ask it. That's much more tragic, isn't it? And at petachlo is, I think, a very, very appropriate response to such a child. That's not acceptable. Open, it's like it's stuck in his head. Petachlo, find a way for him to get that out. Liftoach, like you say, liftoach et hapeh, to open your mouth. Get it out of his mouth. So I want to challenge your Haggadot that, or maybe just your interpretation that this is a stupid child. I don't think it's the case at all. I think the Haggadah is very worried about such a child. He is the very opposite of the Chacham and the Rasha. Chacham and the Rasha have no problem talking. That's why we like them. Yeah, their questions come from a different place, but at least they're talking. The she'eino yodeh lishol could be a very good boy, but he is dangerous. When you don't know how to speak, when you take everything in the world as a direct order and don't know how to challenge and don't know how to delve deeper, then you are not free. So you're worse than the wicked. We could spend the whole class talking about the four sons. It's such a fascinating midrash, but I hope I've given you some different ideas about what how to interpret this passage and how to relate to these four children at the Seder, and maybe open up some discussions at your own Seder about how we understand the passage. Okay?
I like the idea that there are no stupid children, because I've always believed that kids are taught to be stupid. They're not stupid as they come into the world.
Right. You like the idea that there's no stupid child. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there is a stupid child here. Right? The one who is, there's a basic child, which means just aware, but no real interest yet to delve deeper. But
every child
everyone's
can be taught-
thinking.
yeah, every child can be taught law.
Every child can be taught more. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the next midrash. Yes.
So I remember reading someplace that it's very important that you go through it in the language that everyone understands. Babylonian times, was there Aramaic or something?
So you read that it's important to go through the Haggadah in a language that everyone understands. Yeah.
You understand what's going on.
Right.
If you go through it, English, you do it in English.
Yes.
Because if you just kind of go through it in Hebrew, you would understand it. And I think it was originally in Aramaic, and correct me if I'm wrong. And wasn't it originally?
No. The Haggadah was originally, the Mishnah says it was originally read in Hebrew, right? But Aramaic finds its way into different passages.
Okay, or so they would do it in Aramaic, maybe they did it in Aramaic. And
Possibly.
That was the popular tongue at the time.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why it's important to do it in the language.
Yeah, what I would say is be careful with that, though. Yes, it is important that the Haggadah, that you fulfill the requirement of delving into the Exodus from Egypt. You can't do that unless you're speaking in the language that people are speaking around the table. But remember, I said there is a role in this for ritual. So ritual in Judaism is Hebrew. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh is not an actual, these are not actual probing questions. It's a ritual that convey a meaning. And the song and the spirit of the singing is Hebrew, because that's just.
Well, it says on the song, well, when I grew up, there was no song. When we did it, we never did a song.
Oh, really? You never did a song? There's a famous Yiddish version of it, right?
We never did. We never learned a song.
Okay, interesting.
That's why I didn't know the song.
Even though you didn't know a song for Manishtana, you knew songs for other pieces in the Haggadah. Like, the book ends with all these songs. So that's why I say there's clearly in the Haggadah a sense that we need to ritualize this. And the songs are there to help ritualize the ceremony, because singing helps memory, helps us to remember things. So let's go to the next midrash now. It begins Yachol Merosh Chodesh. This midrash asks a question that should be familiar to us since we started learning about Pesach through the biblical commandments that are found in the 12th chapter of Exodus. In the first class I taught, I asked, when is God speaking to Moses in that chapter and saying, this is what you're going to do, right? These are it's the calendar. HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim. When does that happen? It happens on the first day of Nisan. So the question that's being asked here by the Midrash is, why, since that is sort of the beginning of the liberation, right? It's God saying, you're now going to be free. Take this, you have to take the lamb and keep it with you, and then you slaughter it, right? There are all these rituals which begin on the first day of Nisan, including, by the way, the establishment of the Jewish calendar, which is a major act of independence and freedom. Why don't we observe Pesach on the first day of the month? Since that really is what begins the process of liberation. And the answer that the Midrash gives is, there's a verse that says you have to celebrate Pesach on the day when matzah umrorim munachim lefanecha. Sheyesh matzah umaror munachim lefanecha. We saw that verse. Ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li. Because of this. And what does it mean, this? Remember when we encountered that verse in Exodus 12, Ba'avur zeh, because of this, well, the rabbis interpreted that this means the matzah, the maror, and the Passover sacrifice. So we must observe the Passover Seder on the 14th of Nisan, because that is the day when we were told to have the matzah, the maror, and the sacrifice. Munachim, ready in front of us. What is the message here? Why are we reading this passage? This is a reminder to us of what the Passover, how we are to tell the story of the Seder. Remember that this entire section is asking, how do we tell the story? This passage reminds us that the story has to be told with props, that it is a reenactment. It is not sufficient to just sit around with a book and tell the historical account. You have to have in front of you symbols of our history. This is the time in the Seder to go through the Seder plate and to explain the different symbols that are on the plate. The time to point to the matzah and the maror, to the shank bone, right? The memory of the Passover sacrifice. All of this is in front of us today, as it was at the original Seder. And we use all of these different symbols to speak about the Exodus, to symbolize the Exodus. Props are required. The next passage is really when we begin telling the story. It's like, finally, we begin telling the story. So far, it's all, how do we do it? How do we do it? Okay, we have to have props when we do it. We have to start telling the story from slavery and then go towards freedom. We have to remember to respond to questions around the table, answers depending on where the question is coming from. And now we can start telling the story. Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zara. Let's turn to that passage. Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zara Hayu Avotenu. If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about the two opinions in the Mishnah between Rav and Shmuel. They're debating, where do we begin the story? Rav is the one who says, you begin telling the story with idolatry. In other words, before Abraham. Because our liberation from Egypt is not just a liberation from physical servitude, but from spiritual servitude as well. Shmuel's point of view was you should begin the story with freedom from Egypt, or slavery from Egypt, avadim hayinu. But Rav's opinion wins out. In our Haggadot, you have to begin the story not from the point where we're liberated from, when we're enslaved in Egypt, but from earlier on. Why do you think it is important to start the story with the spiritual enslavement of idolatry? I want to give you an idea. Let's read this passage. Mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avotenu. In the early days, from the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Ve'achshav, and now, highlight this word, ker vanu hamakom le'avodato. God brought us nearer to his service. It's a strange way of formulating Jewish history. If I was going to write the story, I would say, well, originally we were idol worshippers and now we're not. But that's not what the Haggadah says. Kervanu is a verb. God brought us closer. But doesn't that imply God bringing us closer that we're not there yet? So if I was going to answer my question, right, why was it important? Why did Rav's opinion win out that we start the Seder with spiritual suffering? I think it's because we're not yet out. The redemption from spiritual enslavement, it's clear, is a bondage that we are not yet free from. We're closer. Kervanu hamakom, God brought us closer away from that type of idolatry, but the process continues. Whereas physical bondage, well, we're not slaves anymore to Pharaoh in Egypt. The story almost, if it were told in that way, lacks permanent resonance. It's over. First we were slaves and now we're not. But I think that verb kervanu is really important. It reminds us of why we have to have a Seder every year, because idolatry is a persistent problem that has not gone away. There is idolatry today, much of it, money and social approval and physical beauty, right? These are all different types of idolatries that still exist in the world. And yes, and in the Jewish world as well. And yes, kervanu hamakom, God brought us closer, but not out of it. It's a process that needs to continue even now. People ask me all the time, what is the problem with why does the Torah mention idolatry and the prohibition of idolatry so often? What is this obsession with not bowing down to idols? I mean, do we really care? If you're a good person, then who cares what you worship in the privacy of your homes? But for Judaism, the problem with idolatry is that it ascribes to physical things power and status over invisible things. That is the anti-Judaism. Judaism came into the world to say it's the things that you can't see that really matter. Things like justice and love and truth and empathy and knowledge and God. The things that you can't see are what really matters. And Egyptian culture in particular was a culture that enslaved people for physical reasons. We were not there serving food to people. We were not working as waiters in Egyptian restaurants. What does the Torah say about what our ancestors were doing there. We were building cities. And if you know, still today, the wonders of the world and the most beautiful, I mean, you can see, I was just watching a documentary on Netflix about mummies that they found in the desert. I mean, you have to see these coffins that they would put people in. Coffins. In other words, things that you will never see again after they go into the ground. They would spend months making designs with hieroglyphics on coffins. It's the very definition of a culture that's enslaved to physicality, to beauty. I mean, there is something nice about this, but it clearly crosses an Egyptian culture into the realm of worship of physical things. So to me, it's no wonder that Rav's argument wins the day. And when we're speaking of liberation, we have to talk about idolatry and how, both because of how the Egyptian story really begins, how the Jewish story really begins, the rejection of the Egyptian culture, and also because it is a problem that persists, right?
So many of the other stories, like the flood, for example, there are stories that are told in other cultures.
Yep.
But this story, the story of the liberation, is so unique.
It's a Jewish story, but it's been borrowed by many other people.
But it has a spiritual element
Yes.
that makes it different. When you think of the other liberations of people from slavery, and there's been a lot of that.
Yes.
It's the spiritual element and the knowing that idolatry is wrong and discovering it that I think makes the story so unique.
Yeah, and I think that,
meaning.
right. Remember, Pharaoh is sort of that, he's that physical, the culture of physicality, the culture of idolatry is represented in Pharaoh. And the way the story is told in the Torah, I offered this to you a couple months ago. I said, this is a war between God and Pharaoh. That's how the Torah portrays this. Pharaoh is going up against God. Pharaoh represents the human, the touchable, the material, and God represents the invisible, right? That's why, what is the force that ultimately kills, what is the last plague of Egypt? It's an invisible energy that passes over homes, that kills people, that destroys the physical, right? It's all symbolic for something you can't see is happening and is altering, changing, or I would say defeating what the eyes see. That is the story of our Exodus. And it is a process that I think we still struggle with because we all have senses that are stronger than our sense of the invisible. So we've got to keep working at it. And it tells us why we have a Seder every year.
It's also a culture that focused on the afterlife and put so much of its material well-being into what's going to happen after. We're taking everything with us.
Right. It focused on its.
Focuses on how you live.
Yeah. So the afterlife is a different story, but I think that I mentioned the whole mummy thing because, yeah, they focused on the afterlife, but look at how excess focus on the afterlife translates into physical obsessions in this life.
They thought you could take it with.
Like those pyramids, right? Those pyramids were about the afterlife, but no, they're not. They're here. I can see them. I can touch them. Right? So this whole obsession with the afterlife, you would think, you know, at least in Christianity, they say you live a life of simplicity because that's the life that really matters. But Egyptian culture is no, you know, even the way you live here should match the way the way you're going to be treated in the afterlife. So you need a big pyramid to show where you're going to be buried, to remind, the afterlife, that you're an important person. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not an expert, but I know enough about just watching these documentaries, how extraordinarily materialistic Egyptian culture was. And Judaism comes in to defeat that message. It's no wonder that the story begins with, let's start with, what is idolatry? What is materialism? And let's understand that Egyptian culture is all around us still. And God brought us nearer through the Exodus, but he didn't bring us out. We're still working on that. So let's keep reading this passage. Shene'emar. There's a proof text here. So understand that the proof text is meant to explain why we start the story and why we have to start the story with idolatry and not with the Exodus from Egypt. Or excuse me, bondage in Egypt, which you would think is where we start the story. Vayomer Yehoshua el kol ha'am. What a weird proof text. Who is Yehoshua? Who's Yehoshua? Right, Moses' successor. So the proof text that the Haggadah is using is a text from the book of Joshua, the 24th chapter. It is Joshua's final speech to the people. Just like at the end of the Torah, Moses gives a last speech before he dies. At the end of Sefer Yehoshua, Joshua gives a speech to the people before he dies. I brought a copy of the book of Joshua. I just want to read in English so you understand what is going on in this passage. Joshua's final address and his death. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and called for the elders of Israel and for their heads and for their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Big gathering. And Joshua said unto all the people, this is now I'm reading from the Haggadah. Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, your fathers dwelt of old time beyond the river, even Terach, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Joshua is addressing the people and giving them their history, giving them their sense of identity. Joshua, who is the one who takes the Israelites and brings them into the promised land, says, don't forget that your ancestors served other gods. And I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him throughout all the land of Canaan and multiplied his seed and gave him Isaac. God is the one who, through Abraham, right, creates this monotheistic religion tied to a land. And I gave unto Isaac Jacob, and Esau I gave unto Esau Mount Seir to possess it, and Jacob and his children went down into Egypt. This is where the passage of the Haggadah ends. But I want to keep reading. And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt according to that which I did in the midst thereof, and afterward I brought you out. And I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came unto the sea, and the Egyptians pursued after your fathers with chariots and with horsemen unto the Red Sea. And when they cried out to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and brought you upon them and covered them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt, etc., etc. Isn't it interesting that this passage, just the next verse after, talks about the Exodus from Egypt, but the Haggadah doesn't quote it. The Haggadah mentions nothing about Joshua's reminder to the people that you were slaves. So I think we learn from this passage from what is left out as much as we learn from what is included. The theme of the Haggadah that we're going to see repeat itself over and over again, a theme that we've already talked about, is homelessness and homeness. That's not a word, but you know what I mean. It is very important for Joshua that he conveys the message to people that idolatry and homelessness are interconnected. And God's bringing Abraham to Judaism is parallel with God bringing Abraham into the land. Joshua, it's very important for him that he begins the story with idolatry for that reason. If the goal of the Haggadah is eventually to get to redemption and get to homeness, then the story ought to begin with the opposite. Not being at home, not having a God, being enslaved in many ways to the culture of idolatry. So that's Joshua's text. This is Joshua's speech, which the rabbis anchor right in the middle of the Haggadah. We're sort of right in the middle of the story here to say, you see, Joshua knew how to tell the story. Just before he died, he had a choice of what to tell the people. He could have said, I brought you down to, I could have started the story and said, we started out slaves and God brought us out and now we're here. But homelessness it's insufficient for homelessness to begin just with being in Egypt. There's a worse homelessness. There's physical homelessness, but there's spiritual homelessness as well. And that story begins earlier. It begins with Terach, Abraham's father, and Nahor, and they served other gods. Part of me wonders whether this is where the Haggadah becomes very universalistic, or universalist, I think the word is. So far, we're telling the story of the Jewish people, right? This is our experience, our story. But mitchila ovdei avodah zara hayu avotenu opens up, doesn't it, a sense of, before the Jewish story began, we have to remember that we were just people, like everybody else. And without God separating Abraham, calling Abraham, we wouldn't have a Seder to begin with. How does that help in the story of, why is that important? Why do you think the Haggadah might pause to remind us that before we were Jews, we were just people? I don't want to answer. I mean, I want to ask first. What think for a second. You know, this is really, so far, this has been about the Jewish story, right? We haven't seen anything yet that's made the Haggadah universalist. But this is the first part. Am I wrong? This is the first part of the Haggadah where we sort of say, let's start the story even further back and remember when we were just people and begin there. Yeah, I think that's why. And that's why this passage is really important and unfortunately undervalued in the Haggadah.
We didn't hear.
I'll repeat it again. The suggestion was,
We're no better than.
we are no better than anybody else. Right? Now, that's a very difficult concept because the Torah does say, well, you are the God's treasured people or the chosen people. But on the other hand, what does that mean? Treasured and chosen people. Are there other treasured and chosen people? We can get in a whole class about what it means to be the chosen people. But I think the Haggadah, remember, Night of Freedom, the themes of liberation, Egyptian culture and values versus Jewish culture and values. It would be quite extraordinary for me if the Haggadah did not at some point address the core Jewish idea that every person, Jewish, not Jewish, idolater, non-idolater, is created in God's image and is equal before God. If the Haggadah did not mention that at some point, I think there would be something deficient in the Haggadah. This is a story of a people that is enslaved by others who believed that they were inferior status. How could the Haggadah be a response to slavery without at some point saying that is not the Jewish way? In order to deliver that message, the Haggadah cannot begin with slavery in Egypt. By then, we were already a separated people. So why does Rav's argument win the day? Why do we begin telling the story with Arami Oved Avi, with Mitrila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu? From the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers, because it reminds us that we are not treasured because of where we come from. We're not important because we have a higher status than anybody else. We're only treasured by God because of what we do, not because of who we are. If we're good people, if we follow the commandments, then God likes us. But God didn't separate us out from anybody else because we were better than them. We were idolaters just like everybody else was. Right? So I think that this is a really important passage in the Haggadah. The first time when we really emphasize the humanistic approach of Judaism, the fundamental idea that humanity is equal before God, that there are not hierarchies, and that God did not free us because we were better than anybody else. Right? God separated us out. Isn't that what it says? Let me go back to the passage. Va'ekach et avichem. I took your grandfather Abraham, me'ever hanahar, from one side of the river and took him to the other side of the river. I took him, not because he's better than anybody, but because God needed a people to fulfill the mitzvot, to carry forward the covenant of God's understanding of the world and our obligations to the world, but not because Abraham was better than anybody else. Yes.
I think that passage could also be there as an admonition because as a people, we've always had a tendency to backslide, and idol worship has become, in whatever form it takes, like today, maybe materialism has become a part of our lives again.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yes, I hope that I mentioned that this passage reminds us that idolatry is a persistent problem. That's one reason why I say Rav wins out. Physical bondage in Egypt was, but thankfully is no more. But spiritual bondage, idolatry, still exists, right? But I don't think that's the only reason. This is another reason why I think this passage is important, because it gives voice to the universalist element in Judaism. It makes a statement that you are no better than anybody else, that you should remember where you came from, right? And that you're only special because of what you do. V'kervanu Hashem la'avodato. What does that mean? God brought us closer la'avodato, in order to work for him. Not because we're better. It's not God brought us out because he liked you more. It's God brought you closer because he needs people to do his work. Okay, so that's, how are we on time? Not great. Let me just do one more passage. Baruch, because I think it sort of flows from the last one. Baruch Shomer Havtachto. Blessed is God, the keeper of his promise to Israel. For the Holy One, blessed is he, took into account the limits of endurance to do according to that which had been said to our father Abraham in the covenant between the parts. As it is written, he said to Abraham, know with certainty that your offspring will be aliens in a land that is not theirs. This passage asks one, the Haggadah is such an incredible book. It covers everything, everything. This passage before just covered, okay, what does humanity have in common? Why is Judaism different than other nations of the world? Because we believe in the equality of all people. We believe that the things that are invisible in the world, the values that are invisible in the world, matter more than the things we can see. One of the biggest questions posed to modern day religion, maybe the biggest challenge to modern day religion, is why do bad things happen to good people? So just like I asked on the last passage, how could we have a Haggadah without at some point making the statement that Judaism believes in equality? I would also say, how could we have a Haggadah that doesn't address the question of why our ancestors were enslaved in the first place? And why there's evil in the world in the first place? If we're all equal and God wants us to be equal, then why create evil? Why create enslavement? This passage is the passage in the Haggadah that addresses that question. Why do bad things happen? Where is that here? God kept his promise to the Jewish people, because God made a covenant with Abraham and said to him, your descendants are going to go down into Egypt and they're going to be enslaved there, and then I will take them out. In other words, God is responsible for evil in the world. God planned slavery. It was all in God's plan. And remember, this is Leil Shimurim. We saw that in the Torah. This is the night of fulfilled promises. Baruch Shomer Havtachato L'Amo Yisrael. God kept his word. What was the word that God kept? That one day, after spending time in Egypt, enslaved, we would be redeemed. and it happened on Pesach. It's the night of fulfilled promises. So why is it that there is evil in the world? Why did God create slavery and evil and murderers and bad people? I think what this text is trying to say, God made a covenant with Abraham. In other words, even before this story began, God said, your people will need to endure hardship before they get it easy. There is a theology here. You may disagree with it, but it's being presented in the Haggadah in a particular way we should be conscious of. The theology is, in order for the Jewish people to appreciate freedom, they first needed to endure bondage. It's what in modern theology you would say, you can't, what is good? Good is the absence of evil. There is no such thing as good and evil. There's only evil, and not having evil is what is good. In order to first know what goodness is, you need to endure and experience evil. For Jews who ask this question, both about historical events and about what they are enduring in the moment, this is a very emotional and difficult and challenging question. But Jews always said there is meaning and purpose to suffering. We may not always understand why or what, but there is no such thing as suffering without reason. God plans everything out. Just like the Exodus, the bondage in Egypt was in God's plan, was right there, delivered to Abraham years before. Your descendants are going to go down to Egypt. So does the suffering that we endure today have meaning and purpose and was in God's plan. Now, I understand this is a huge topic, and we could go on and on about why bad things happen to good people. But I just want us to understand where, first of all, that the Haggadah asks this question. So if it's a topic you want to explore at your Seder, and by the way, everyone post-Holocaust generation, every year I get asked this question: why did slavery happen in the first place? Why did God suddenly wake up and say, I'm going to redeem this people? Why did they have to endure so much before that happened? So it's a really interesting question to explore. And I think it's so not surprising that the Haggadah references that question right here in this passage. You will not be able to get through the Seder without asking the question, why suffering in the first place? And the theology of the Haggadah, whether you appreciate it or not, is freedom won't mean anything to you unless you first go through difficult times. Before you learn what a gift freedom is, live life with the absence of it. So, maybe that's the question we can end with today. Do you agree or disagree? Is there some truth there? This is the you don't know what you got till it's gone theology of Judaism, right? You need to experience what evil is to understand good, and experience what good is to understand evil. They are meaningless on their own. It is definitely a theology that is emphasized in the Bible. Why must you be kind to strangers? Because you were a stranger. There's the theology, a couple of dozen times in the Torah is emphasizing that all of Judaism, all of its obligations are rooted in evil. Not because God freed you from Egypt are you kind to the stranger, but because you endured slavery. So I don't think we should be surprised by this passage at all, but I think it's possible to challenge it. I'm not saying you should challenge. That's the role of, your families at the Seder to talk about this and what it means. But the Haggadah's emphasis is you will not know what you have unless you first know what it is to have nothing. And with that theme of homelessness and home, you will not know to appreciate your home unless you first know what it's like not to have one. So I think there's a lot of truth there. It may not be entirely true or satisfactory, but I think there's a lot of truth there. Okay, so this is where we're ending off. And by the way, you can see how the next passage, Vehi She'amda, flows right from there. Vehi She'amda is, in every generation we go through difficult times, and Vehi She'amda says, and don't worry, just like God redeemed us before, God will redeem us again. But this is actually a good place to stop in the Haggadah, because now we go into the midrashim that really begin to tell the story. So far, we're talking about big questions in Judaism, and I'm happy to stop here because I hope you have my goal in this class was to tell you or to prove to you that the Haggadah is, aside from the Torah, the greatest book in Judaism. This is the most important book in Judaism because it's a greatest hits. It asks all the big questions. What are the topics we've already seen here? What is the nature of chosenness? Just today, the nature of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? What is Judaism about? Why do we focus on spiritual things when others focus on physical things? Education, questioning what it means to be silent in the face of cruelty, right? All of these big questions that are, I think, at the heart of the human experience are all addressed in very short passages. It gives us windows to inquire and discuss. So you have no excuse to carry on the same Seder every year as the year before. There's no way, because these are the biggest questions in life, and the Haggadah gives you space to probe them based on whatever is going on in the world around you at that time. You can find a place in the Haggadah to relate, and that is the goal, to every year journey a little bit closer towards the ideal that the Haggadah imagines, right? From slavery to liberation, but today's slavery and liberation, not just that of our ancestors. So thank you. I've gone a bit long today, but I wanted to end on a bit of a summative point. We're going to continue. I just not exactly clear when, because I think if we go, I really hope it doesn't get bad again. But if it does get bad again with shutdowns and stuff, I know people appreciate having a class because there'll be nothing to do. Please, I hope that's not what happens. But if it does, I might do this to help entertain me and others during a time when we might be, when the world might be a little bit more closed than it is today. But let's not presume. I just hope everything turns out okay. And if so, we'll pick up again in the winter.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. This is
Thanks
wonderful.
everybody on Zoom.
Fascinating.